Hello and welcome to another instalment of GRC Solutions TV. Today we're revisiting the topic of anti-bribery legislation and compliance, and once again we have with us Jane Ellis, the principal of Assertia. Jane, thanks for your time.
Thank you very much.
How has the landscape of anti-bribery legislation and compliance changed since the last time we talked?
The laws themselves haven't changed so much, but I think the continued enforcement and the higher public profile around enforcement has changed considerably. There was an OECD working group report that came out in October last year looking at Australia's enforcement and compliance of an implementation of the anti-bribery laws, and said in the nicest possible way that Australia was wanting in a lot of respects, including in relation to enforcement. The Australian Federal Police, or the AFP, have taken this on board, and they have actually established a foreign bribery, anti-bribery expert panel that's an internal panel within the AFP, and they've also set up a separate fraud and anti-corruption division which is responsible for investigating these kinds of crimes. So you can tell that they've actually started to increase the enforcement, or at least increase their resourcing of enforcement within the AFP. Over and above that, the AFP now actually have an ongoing working group with various other investigators from the States, the FBI, from Canada, the RCMP, and from the City of London, which are the City of London Police, and they get together with them on a fairly regular basis to exchange ideas and exchange programs that they have in place, and exchange tactics which each of them can use in terms of conducting investigations. So I would say in terms of this landscape that we're probably going to see a few more prosecutions a little bit more frequently.
Mm-hmm. Now, you recently attended the International Bar Association, or IBA, conference in Jakarta. Can you tell us a little bit about that conference and what came out of it?
The IBA Anti-Corruption Conference was a very unusual one insofar as it was actually set in this region. That was the first one to actually be held in this region. Generally, before the IBA has considered the world to be Europe and the US, and or North America more broadly. So it's good to actually see the IBA as expanding their area of interest and influence into the Asia-Pacific region. It was held in Jakarta, and it was well attended by about 80 lawyers from both within Indonesia, but also to Singapore, United States, Australia, and the UK. It covered a range of different topics. So it was looking at things like procurement, it was looking at due diligence, it was looking at the roles of lawyers in terms of perpetuating and managing the risk of anti-corruption, and also to the role of lawyers in actually perpetuating corruption. And I think it went down extremely well, and it was opened by the Vice President of Indonesia, who was not shy about talking about corruption and the negative impact corruption had on Indonesia, and how important it was for Indonesia to address the problem.
And the IBA has noted that there are still challenges that arise in Asia when it comes to tackling corruption. Can you tell us a little bit about those challenges and what companies can do to mitigate risk?
That's a very, very interesting question, and it's a very difficult one to address, I think, in a very small period of time. But essentially the challenges are that corruption has become so entrenched in a lot of different societies. I won't say culturally, because I can't say, I think it would be a little bit simplistic to say that corruption is actually a cultural phenomenon within these countries. A lot of the times it's become a social one and an economic one. And it has become so all-pervasive that it's very difficult for a lot of companies to operate to know how to actually circumvent or to overcome the demands for bribes or facilitation payments. And a lot of the times, for an example, if a company is trying to get approval to put something in place or to get construction contracts to proceed, then the approvals can be on on a go-slow basis until such time as either the company just waits it out, that could be several months, or else that they decide to make a payment to try and actually speed up the process. And a lot of the times companies that are desperate to actually meet deadlines are prepared to actually risk the potential of prosecution by making a small payment. In terms of actually what companies can do to mitigate that risk, the big companies, I think, have the advantage of they've got a big name behind them, and quite often the government wants them in the country, so is prepared to actually do what is required to make sure that they stay there. It's the smaller companies that I think tend to have more of a problem, and it's not to say the bigger companies don't, but the smaller ones have got less leverage. And there is now a bit of a move by some companies to at least start engaging informally with each other to try and get some lessons learned from each other about what to do in certain circumstances, what to expect when they actually start engaging with various approval processes, and using that information to try and actually put in place due diligence programs, and also to provide methods of responses that they can actually go back and respond to when a demand for a bribe does actually arise.
Now, we talked last time about the UK Bribery Act, and in particular the so-called corporate or passive offence. Under this offence, companies can be held liable for failing to prevent bribes made by their intermediaries. What impact has this offence had on Australia?
It's actually been a very profound one, I must say, Adrian, and it's been really interesting. I think it's the combination of UK Bribery Act, and in particular that offence, as well as the prosecutions of security note printing in Australia, have really galvanised a lot of the corporate activity and really raised the profile of the anti-bribery laws. We're increasingly finding that companies, Australian companies that have to contract with British companies, for example, are expected to have in place some anti-corruption policies and procedures, and that some of them have been quite surprised by that, thinking that they're not subject to the UK Bribery Act or to UK laws, or why do they actually need those checks and balances in place? And a lot of companies now are starting to actually put in place those codes of conduct, those policies and those procedures, and are starting to actually roll out their training on a fairly comprehensive basis. So I think it is actually, given the global nature of a lot of companies now, the fact that most companies in Australia, even if they never operate outside of Australia, have some kind of connection either with a US company or the UK company, such that the expectations are that they would have a compliance program in place, and they won't get the business unless they actually do have that program in place.
So just a final question. What is the difference between a bribe and hospitality? And what can companies do to ensure that they and their intermediaries stay within the boundaries of hospitality, not bribery?
That's, again, another very good question, and a very tricky one in terms of its implementation overall. Gifts, entertainment and hospitality have a very traditional place in business engagement and business relations. And a lot of the times going out for lunch with somebody with a counterpart is actually perfectly legitimate. Often it ends up being what the value of the gift, entertainment or hospitality is, and the context in which it's actually provided. And certainly, for example, an example that I think I referred to previously, there's a company, Novartis, in the United States, is now subject to a civil prosecution by 27 states and local councils in the United States for actually wining and dining and bestowing lavish gifts on doctors in order to encourage the doctors to actually prescribe their medicines to their patients. And in one instance, they refer to a dinner with three that add up to about $10,000. That I would regard as rather lavish. In the end, what happens if you're actually starting to look at any form of gifts, entertainment, or hospitality, either that the companies, somebody within the companies to receive, or actually wants to bestow on somebody else, there are a range of things you need to look at. And firstly, it's whether or not the recipient is entitled to receive it. In a lot of countries, the government officials are not actually allowed to accept any form of hospitality in any way, shape or form. And that means it's incumbent on the company to understand or to be aware of what the local laws actually are. The second circumstance is whether or not there are any approvals coming up. So for example, if you've actually just responded to a tender and the working group within the government is still considering all those tenders, then it's probably not an appropriate time to actually invite those officers who are responsible for considering those tenders out for a lavish dinner. But if the company and some government officials are actually working together on a project, and at the end of the day they want to go out for a dinner, then provided it's not $10,000 for 3 people, that's probably likely to fall within the bounds of what is appropriate and provide all the various approvals that are in place. We are finding now that a lot more companies are being very prescriptive about their gifts, hospitality and entertainment policies and procedures, and they might actually put in place various thresholds above which if an employee actually wants to give a gift or receive a gift, they'll actually have to get an approval from somebody far more senior before they're able to do so. And at least you've got some kind of audit trail as to where the money's actually being spent.
Jane, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.